right, good evening, everyone. I know that some worksheets have been passed out. If you do not have a worksheet, go ahead and raise your hand really, really high. And Brad and Janelle are working together to make sure that everyone has one. So if you don't have one, raise your hand really, really high right now. Josh was the only one. Okay, he's good. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for being here. This is a different format. I think intentionally we've tried to make this just a little bit different. I want it to be more like a Bible class. I want us to learn. We're going to dig deep into the Word. The concept is absolutely fantastic for us to take passages that we are very, very familiar with, but yet still we want to dig a little bit deeper into them. I think that, you think about passages perhaps that you've memorized in your life. So we know them, we've memorized them so much to the point where maybe we take them for granted. And so the idea is that we're reinvestigating these passages that we have become so very familiar with. And so tonight we're going to dig into 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We're going to study the context, the text, and the application. You should have all those worksheets available. All of our kids should have a kids worksheet that follows the same kind of material as well, just a little bit more, maybe a little bit more fun with word searches and those kinds of things on there as well. But also I'm encouraging anybody that's in the 5th grade, 6th grade and up to certainly get one of the worksheets that say the context, the text, and the application, because I know that our 5th and 6th graders can follow along and learn just as well as our adults can. And so we're going to attempt to do that. We are live, I went live on our Facebook page just a moment ago on our YouTube channel, just to make it easy. If anybody is not able to be there, they can catch this later on and watch it. They can also watch it live right now if they're tuning into it. So that's kind of neat and handy. That's why my phone is right here with this microphone, so it's just catching everything. I set up a table up here for myself. This is the way I'm going to do it because I want it to be more like let's study the Bible together instead of just a lecture. I think there's some really good things for us to look at. We're going to get maybe a little bit more technical than what we normally have. To me, this is not a lecture type of a lesson. This is more of a Bible study kind of lesson. So if you have comments, if you have questions, feel free. Raise your hand. Let us know. I'll probably repeat your questions so that we can do this together. I'm just thrilled. This is a good crowd. Look around you. These are people that have gathered together to study the Bible. So I think it's a lot of fun. There's no gimmicks or anything like that. Well, I did put out some candy for everybody to enjoy. And the candy has a little bit of a theme. Who can tell me what that theme might be? Does anybody know? What is it? Well, it's very much Halloween, yes. But there's something else about it.
It's colorful.
It's very colorful. Yeah, that's true. Now, we're gathered together for DoubleTake, right? So everything on there is either double bubble, double mint, or candies that have 2 ingredients in it. I just thought that was fun. So enjoy that as we study the Bible together and try not to get too much of a sugar high this evening. Well, like I said, we are going to follow a pattern or formula for us to study this together. We're going to look at the context. That's the first worksheet that you should have, where there's some fill in the blanks, just to get us an idea of what this passage is all about. I know how important it is when you're studying the Bible to not just look at a verse and try to figure out the meaning behind it without going and looking at the verses around it. And so that's why it's important for us to look at the context and also just the historical context that's available to us with each passage. So with Corinthians, it's important for us to know a little bit about the church, about the situation, about the author, and those kinds of things. So we're going to hit on some of those things here in just a moment. We're also going to look at the text. That's where we're going to get really down deep into the Word and look at meanings of words and that kind of thing. This past week, I spent about 2 or 3 days just translating from the original language this chapter, word by word. And I don't do that very often. Usually when there's a word that piques my interest, I might investigate it into the original language, and then I might include that in a sermon. But with this, I thought it was important to dig down deep, and I translated the entire chapter. It took a lot of work to do that, and I think it'll be handy for us as we go through that. We'll also look at the application. This is the last thing. A lot of times when people study the Bible, they want to go to the application first. They see a verse and they're like, oh great, how does this apply to me? And we don't consider how it applies to the original readers. What did the author intend to be read and to be understood by the words that he used? That's why we're going to look at the context and then the text and then make application to it. Because you can't make application into your life until you understand the application it was for the original readers. So we're going to go through that as well. So let's dig down into 1 Corinthians chapter 13 tonight. And we're going to start with the context first of all. So if you've got your handout, hey Dylan, would you go get me right here? Give me one of the worksheets that say the context on it, that first one, just so that I can follow along with you guys as well. I don't want to be too far off from y'all. And just a quick commercial break. Anyway, we are going to offer the Lord's Supper later on if someone needs to partake of that as well. And we'll have a prayer at the very end of this as well. Okay, so the context. The first thing that I want to mention is just kind of a little bit about Corinth. Corinth was an important and wealthy city that was on an isthmus, an isthmus, which was separating the northern and southern Greece. And does anybody know what an isthmus is? Any idea? Do you? Okay.
It's like two sides of water with one narrow strip of land.
Yes, that's exactly right. Daniel's got it right. It's two sides of water and with a narrow strip of land that's there between it. So it was a really great strategic place for the Roman Empire, Corinth was, because they could transport things easily across that isthmus to be able to get to the other parts of the sea. I've got a little bit of a map for us that kind of show us. I want to give you just overview real quick of where we're at. The Mediterranean Sea is in the very middle of the map. And then I pointed out Jerusalem down here. And then Corinth is all the way over on the other side. There's Jerusalem. And then there's Corinth right over here. So that's where you can see that isthmus that's there. I'll zoom in just a little bit where you can see it a little bit better. Whoop, I went too far. There you go. So that's where Corinth is. And it just kind of helps us to see. So you can imagine how convenient it would be to go from the Aegean Sea into the Adriatic Sea to be able to ship things up into Europe. They could cut through at Corinth, unload the ships, carry everything over on land, and then reload another ship to get it over there. It's a lot easier to do so. Later on, they actually tried to build a very narrow canal, and they worked on it a long time, and then it never got completed. And then more recent modern time, there is actually a canal there where they can go right through that area of the land and around the land through the sea. So pretty neat. All right, so the Apostle Paul spent 18 months there on his second missionary journey to establish the church there. We read about this in Acts chapter 18. That's the next little slide here for us. So that's helpful. So Apostle Paul spent 18 months there on his second missionary journey. If I'm going too fast or anything, just let me know and I'll slow down just a little bit. So Acts chapter 18 gives us a lot more detail about Paul's work there in Corinth during that time. It was at the conclusion of his visit to Corinth that he was able to leave, and he goes to visit Ephesus, Jerusalem, Antioch, and then on to Galatia. Acts chapter 18, verse 18 through 23, it says this: Paul, having remained there many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchrea he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. They came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they asked him to stay for a little longer, he did not consent. But taking leave of them, and saying, I will return to you again if God wills. He set sail from Ephesus when he had landed at Caesarea. He went up and greeted the church and went on down to Antioch, and having spent some time there, he left and passed successfully through the Galatian region and to Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So here we got a little bit of a snapshot of where we are in Acts chapter 18 and where we're at in Paul's second missionary journey. After leaving Corinth, Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians at Corinth, warning them not to associate with immoral people. And this is a kind of important thing for us to notice. Perhaps this letter that he wrote to them is a letter that we don't have. So we've got 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but in 1st Corinthians, he talks about writing a letter to them, okay? Something that he had already written. And so it's kind of neat to think about. Perhaps there was some other kind of dialogue that Paul had with Corinth that we do not have in the Scriptures. Now, here's my point to this. Whatever he wrote, he probably felt like he needed to say it again. So whatever the first letter contains is probably what the second letter, which is 1 Corinthians, has in it. So he wrote to them. They did not do what he wanted them to do. And so he wrote 1 Corinthians to them, trying to correct them even further. Eventually they do correct themselves and get back in the right way with God. And he writes 2 Corinthians to them. So there may have been like an original letter or dialogue that Paul had with the people in Corinth before we read 1 Corinthians. So I think that's kind of a neat thing to read about. That's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 9, where he says, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. So there's that past tense idea that he wrote something before he wrote this first letter that we read today, and calling it 1 Corinthians. So anyway, I think that's kind of a neat little thing there. All right, let's keep going here. 1 Corinthians, he provides apostolic guidance for dealing with problems he has heard from Chloe's people. That's what he says in chapter 1, verse 11. There's some things that he has heard about from Chloe's people. I don't know who Chloe's people are. Some kind of a secret Corinthian mafia or something like that. Whatever the case is, Paul's in the know about it. And they've told him about this situation, these problems. And so now he's writing this letter to them to correct these problems even further. And so he wants to guide them in the problems that they're facing. All right, in chapters 8 through 10, Paul addressed the issue of eating food that had been sacrificed to idols. Okay, so that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 9, and 10. That's the issue that he's addressing, eating food that has been sacrificed to idols. This is going to all set us all up for what we're going to read about in chapter 13, so just hang tight with me. All right, in chapter 11, he dealt with the issues of head coverings and abuses of the Lord's Supper. A lot of times we'll turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 to read about Paul's dialogue and how the Lord instituted the Lord's Supper. And so he's correcting some methods that the Corinthians had taken liberty in on how they partook of the Lord's Supper, and dealing with that issue in chapter 11. Okay? All right, in chapters 12 through 14, Paul deals with the issue of spiritual gifts, which had become a divisive issue among those brethren. Paul repeatedly addresses issues related to the gift of tongues in chapter 12, verse 10, verse 28, verse 30, and then chapter 13, verse 1 that we'll look at here in just a moment. He mentions tongues. And then chapter 14, verse 2, and then verse 4 through 25 of chapter 14, he deals with the speaking in tongues and dealing with these spiritual gifts. Apparently, some of the Corinthian Christians count speaking in tongues as a more significant spiritual gift. Okay? A more significant spiritual gift. And they had become somewhat prideful about their ability to speak in tongues. Okay? So then we find in chapter 14, Paul goes to great lengths to put that gift of speaking in tongues into perspective. And he basically teaches them that prophecy, the gift of prophecy, Not speaking in tongues is the superior gift. He says that in verses 1 through 5. Speaking in tongues the way to describe it is speaking in a language that is something that they would be able to understand if they had an interpreter. Now, it's amazing to think about. If I was to, I've never studied Chinese. I don't know if I could really say one or two words in Chinese. But if I was to be able to speak Chinese in front of you tonight, you would know that's a miracle, because I've never spoken Chinese before. And so therefore, if it's a miracle, then it's from God. And therefore, what I'm speaking in Chinese would be teachings from God. Now, the neat thing is the other spiritual gift was the gift of interpretation. Someone else would be able to interpret that. Perhaps someone that had never even studied Chinese either. And that would be a miracle. Therefore, what they are speaking and translating what I speak has to be, again, from God. And that's the reason behind that. Okay? So speaking a language that no one knows or can't understand does not benefit the church. And that's what Paul is telling them. If you're going to speak in tongues, then you're going to need somebody to interpret. That's what he's teaching them. If you don't have an interpreter, then speaking in tongues does nobody any value whatsoever. If I was to, anybody speak Chinese here? Anybody speak Chinese? Okay, so if I could speak Chinese and I start preaching to you in Chinese, it's doing you no good. It might as well be a clanging cymbal or a clanging gong or a clanging cymbal. Okay, it's just noise. Okay, tuck that little nugget in your head just for a moment. Okay, so there's value in that speaking in tongues, as long as there's someone there to interpret it. So this person who speaks in another language should pray that it would be interpreted. That's what he tells them in chapter 14, verse 13. Because that speech would just, without interpretation would be of no value whatsoever. And that's what he says in verse 14. Okay? So now that sets the stage for us. So if we go back to chapter 12 and the very last verse, the very end of the chapter, he says, "And I show you a still more excellent way." And these words introduce what he has to say in chapter 13, all about love. What we'll find is that while chapter 13 is all about love, love is the more excellent way than any other spiritual gift that anyone may have. Okay? All right, I'll pause here for just a moment. Did everybody get all this filled in? I think we completed everything there, right? Okay, good. If you've got anybody got any questions or any kind of comment whatsoever before we move into the context? Anything at all? Or the text? Good. I know I kind of rambled on, but I think that's good stuff just to set the stage for us. Okay? All right. Now, Dylan, can you get me the one that says the text on it, the second little sheet right there? I appreciate that. Good job, Dylan. Thank you, sir, very much. All right, so I printed this off for you. I was actually inspired by our 5th and 6th grade material. We are giving them the entire book of Acts, and it's printed off for them so that they can read it easily, and everybody's using the same version, and they can use that in class. So I thought, well, that's really neat. We'll do the same thing in this class, just to have it so everybody can even make notes about it and that kind of thing. So I wanted to make it really, really simple for all of us. So let's go ahead and take the time. If there's no comments or no questions whatsoever, let's look at the text. Let's look at the text. Anything at all? Okay, let's read verses 1 through 3. 1 through 3. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, And if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Okay, so we'll stop right there. I want to break this down for you just a little bit. I mentioned something to my Bible class this morning. I love when I see patterns in the text. Patterns in the text. The Bible is full of patterns. And so here we find a pattern in the text. And Paul is notorious. He is just a brilliant writer. And he provides all throughout his letters patterns found in the text that help us and guide us and help us to understand what he's talking about. It's just like a perfect little outline. So here we find a pattern. I'll just ask, can anyone see a few words that are repeated in the text that are like, oh wow, look, he says that several times. Are there a couple words? Yeah, Cal, what are the words?
Love.
Well, that's true. That's true. Love is found many times in this text. But in verses 1 through 3, there's another 2 words or so, one specific word that he uses over and over again. Does anybody know what it is? Yes.
But do not have.
Not, that's a good one.
If I.
If I, that's it. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. This is what I've done in my text. Take the words if I or I have become in verse 1, if I at the beginning of verse 2, if I also in 2, and then I am in verse 2, and then verse 3, if I give all my possessions, and then again in verse 3, if I, okay? So here are 7 parallel examples that Paul is pointing out that solidify his point. He's giving this, the idea of rhetorical force, and he is setting up this hypothetical scenario, okay? This word, if I or I have become, is in subjunctive mood, okay? That's a technical term about how grammar is used, and so here we find this subjunctive mood. And what he's doing is he's making this, he's giving a suggestion. He's creating a hypothetical situation, and he's making himself the case in point. So he says, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become, again in the subjunctive mood. And then verse 2, if I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith as to remove mountains, but do not have nothing, but do not have love, I am nothing. I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned. So anyway, I think it's really interesting to see those kinds of patterns. So I want you to take the time, take that pen out, circle those 7 times that are there, right there in your text, just to help you to see the point that Paul is making with this hypothetical situation. Now, let's get a little bit even deeper in and look at each verse and understand a little bit further along. All right, so I have some of the Greek words up there. What I do when I study the Bible, I love to look for keywords, and I want to identify those keywords. I'll underline them or circle them in my Bible. That I started doing that. I had a keyword study Bible that someone gave me when I first started at Harding, and it did that for me. Showed me some of the keywords, and I started going through there and underline and circle all kinds of keywords. Well, that helps me still to this day when I'm studying the Bible, look through, find the key words, and then understand what those key words are. I think that if I do that, I'll understand the message of that verse. So he says, if I speak with the tongues of men, and the tongues, I think, is a key word. Men is a key word. Angels, maybe, but I didn't really underline angels. There's not anything really super special about that. We'll point some things out maybe a little bit. And then he says, but I do not have love. He says, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And so what Paul is telling us here in this verse is that any speech, any kind of language, Chinese, Italian, Zimbabwean, I'm not sure if that's an actual language or not, but all I'm saying, any kind of language, if I could speak any kind of language whatsoever, of men or of angels, maybe even a heavenly language, whatever language the angels speak. He says, but if I do not have love, I become this noisy gong or clanging cymbal. And so any speech becomes just mere sound waves without love, is what he's telling us in verse 1. This word, tongues, is an interesting word. It is the Greek word, and I can't pronounce them all correctly. David Reese probably can. He's a lot more studious I am than on Greek words. But this word is, I'll just tell you, it comes from the word glossary. Gloss. It's the glossus, okay? And that helps me see what that word means specifically. It's a tongue or a language is what it is. And then there's this word men, and it's important to point out here that this word men is the word anthropon, which is where we get the word anthropology, or the study of mankind. So this is not, he's not saying if I speak with the tongues of male people. He says if I speak with the tongues of mankind, any kind of actual language. And that's an important point to make, because sometimes our Pentecostal friends will tell us that the language that they speak when they speak in tongues is a language that is a heavenly language, that is just gibberish. But the point that Paul is making here is that this should be a language that people would understand. And if they can interpret it, then it's going to be of value to everybody. It wasn't any kind of gibberish or anything like that. This was an actual tongue. There was a glossary that you could look up words and understand them. And that's an important thing to point out. Okay? All right, so then he says, but I do not have love. And this word love, does anybody have any clue? There's two main Greek words that are used in the Bible to describe love. Does anybody know what those words are? Agape, that's right. And what's another one? Does anybody know? Phileo, that's right. There's other Greek words that are used in ancient writings, but these two words are certainly predominant in the New Testament scriptures. Agape is unconditional love. Unconditional love. Whereas phileo would be love between brothers or friends. Okay? A friendly love. Here, the entire context in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul uses agape every single time. An unconditional love. And he says, if I speak these amazing languages, whatever language you may call that, but I don't have agape, unconditional love, it's worthless. It's become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. This word noisy is a key word for me. The word is actually the Greek word echo. And you think about it, when you echo, 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 okay, it makes a noise, right? It's easier. That's how I remember Greek words. I have to associate them with something, right? And it's the idea of noise or ringing, okay? And so this ringing gong, and the word there is like brass or copper or bronze or something like that. And then he says, or a clanging, and the Greek word there is cymbalon, which we translated it cymbal, which we understand what that is. Whoosh, boom, that kind of noise. So if I don't have love, but I can speak all these great languages, and no one can understand me, well, I'm just noise in the background. That's not anything associated with a musical number, okay? So that's an important piece to think about. All right? Any questions or comments about verse 1? Anything at all? All right, let's look at verse 2. You ready? He says, if I have the gift of prophecy, another version may say, if I have prophecy, okay? My New American Standard implies these words, the gift of prophecy, to help us understand that. But that's not necessarily in the original language. But if I have prophecy, and the Greek word there is the Greek word for prophecy, propheteon, okay? Which means to speak forth or to proclaim, all right? Which really, if you think about it, we still do that today. I think we still have people who can prophesy, but we do it just speaking forth the words that have already been prophesied about, the words that are here. Now, when Paul is using this word here, he's talking about the gift of prophecy in the miraculous sense of the word. Being able to speak forth the oracles of God. That would be a special gift. Even more valuable than speaking in tongues. Because with speaking in tongues, you got to have somebody that's going to be able to interpret for you. Whereas with prophecy, you would not. That's why prophecy is a better spiritual gift. He says, if I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries. And this word know is a different word than the word that we find just later on in this verse, where he says, I know all mysteries and all knowledge. The know first is different than the knowledge later. The first word is this Greek word eido, okay? And it means I've realized something. I've come to understand it, okay? I realize all the mysteries. And this word mysteries is the word mysteria that we find in the Greek. It's the secrets. So he says, if I have the gift of prophecy and I understand, I realize all the secret things that God is revealing to his people right here in the first century church. Because you have to remember, they don't have a New Testament to turn to. They've got people who can speak in tongues. They've got people who can prophesy for them and give them what God wants to teach them. So here these great people can prophesy and know all these secret things that God is revealing to them. And he says, if I have all, and here's this word here, gnosko. It's a different word than what was used earlier. If I have all knowledge, and the idea there is understanding. And then he says, if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but I do not have agape love, he says, I am nothing. I am nothing. This word, faith, is the Greek word pisteuo. We'll find it again here in just a little bit. If I were you, I would circle this one. I didn't circle it on the screen or anything, but you might circle it because you're going to find it the very last part of this chapter. Faith as to remove mountains, but I do not have unconditional love. He says, I'm nothing. The Greek word here is uthen. Nothing. That's the way I remember it. Nothing. Uthen. Nothing at all. It means no one. I'm no one. I am no one. If I have all these great things, but I just don't have love, then I'm nothing. All right. Any questions about verse 2? Verse 2. Good stuff. Wonderful stuff. All right, now let's look at verse 3 together. He says here, and if I, again, still in the subjunctive mood, give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but I do not have love, it profits me nothing. All right, so here he says, I give all my possessions. This word give means to parcel out, to all my possessions, all the things that I own, to feed the poor, which is a noble thing, a wonderful thing to be able to do, isn't it? I think that's amazing. But still, he says, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but I don't have love, then it's doing me no good at all. Here, Paul is just giving this inclusion of this act of great benevolence, just to drive home his point even further. So even if the Corinthians do something and it looks like an expression of love, because that's what we would say benevolence is. Benevolence is an expression of love. But yet at the same time, sometimes people can use benevolence to be self-promoting and maybe even self-glorifying. So if there's no love in that, then it's not doing any good whatsoever. And so then Paul subtly changes the verbs from I am nothing, what he says in verse 2, to a different thing. He says, I myself benefit nothing. And it really just reveals his careful use of language right here. Paul giving away all of his possessions. It's not worthless. There's some great benefits that can come to somebody that's going to give and give and give. But it's of no spiritual benefit unless it is done on the basis of love. Even those who would sell not only their things, but even giving up themselves to give everything to the needy, benefit nothing if they just do it for the sake of boasting. And so even Paul, who has given up everything and surrendered his life for the Corinthians' sake, that's what he says in chapter 9. He's given it all up for their benefit. If he doesn't do it out of love, it's of no value whatsoever. No value whatsoever. Okay. Any questions about verses 1 through 3? Anything at all? 1 through 3. Okay. Let's look at verses 4 through 7. Let's read this one together. Paul says, there we go. Thank you, sir. Paul says, love is patient, love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. Again, we find a pattern in the Scripture. There are 15 verbs in in 3 verses. Verses 4, well, I guess actually 4 verses. 4, 5, 6, and 7. 15 verbs that describe the actions and non-actions of love. Okay? I've labeled them all out for you. Here he says, is patient, is kind, is not jealous, does not brag, is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. All right, so in 15 verses, and that should actually say in 4 verses, describe the actions and non-actions of love. And it's important to see that there are 7 positive actions of agape. Okay? 7 positive actions of agape that describe the generosity of God's love, God's agape. And then there are 8 negative non-actions of agape that describe really the area in which the Corinthians need to correct themselves. This is where they are lacking these 8 negative non-actions. These 7 positive things, these are things to describe how God loves. And then these 8 negative ones are the things that the Corinthians need to correct themselves on. Really, you can put your own name and my name in that as well. Areas that we need to do better on as well. All right, so let's break this down just a little bit and talk about each one of these. Okay, so love is patient. Love is patient. So remember what he said, chapter 12, verse 31. I'm going to show you a still more excellent way. An excellent way. Well, here's this excellent way. An excellent way in which Christ followers wait patiently. Wait patiently. The Greek word for patience is derived actually from 2 words. Okay, makros, thumos. Long anger or long suffering. Okay, you're going to wait and you're going to suffer through. And so to be patient is to be long suffering, to endure irritants without allowing your anger to lash out in retaliation. That's what patience is. You've probably seen this kind of patience with people, and maybe even in your own life, where something can so easily be irritating to you, but you're going to bear through it, endure through it, and not lash out in retaliation. You're just going to be patient. I'm just going to wait. That's the kind of patience that agape love is. Endurance. Even when you want to retaliate, you long suffer through it. Then he says that love is kind. The word kind is a lot like agape in that it is an action word. You don't just be kind, you do kind. It suggests being helpful in doing good works. And the patience of verse 4, that here where this involves this irritant, it's holding back this negative reaction. That's the kindness that we find in agape. It involves action, stepping forward to solve a problem or to share a burden, to meet a need that someone may have. Something that the Corinthians should imitate. Then he says, is not jealous. Now you think, these Corinthians, in the context, they're looking at somebody perhaps that's speaking in tongues that's better because they can do this miraculous thing. And maybe somebody that can't speak in tongues is looking at somebody that can and is jealous of them. So Paul says there's a more excellent way. Love is not jealous. Love is patient and is kind and is not jealous at all. They need to imitate that. This word jealous here, they're not jealous, and it's related to the word of being zealous, which really can either be positive or negative. Somebody can be zealous for good works, but you can be just as zealous for bad things. Okay? So it's very, very interesting to see that in the relation there. In the context of this verse, it suggests the intense desire for something that belongs to someone else. The jealousy or the covetousness or the envy. And so someone that can do miraculous gifts, they may have been suffering with jealousy because they can do it and the other person can't. A person who gives in to jealousy cannot love the other person because envy generates negative feelings. And the word here for jealous, this zelu and agape, they're like oil and water. They just can't be mixed together. They cannot abide together. You can't be jealous and be a loving person. They just don't work together at all. Then he says that love does not brag. And this is interesting because he goes on to say, and is not arrogant. But there's two different words there. Does not brag means that this person that loves in this way is someone who is focused on the welfare of another person and not worried about being self-centered and egotistical. They don't work together like that. And once again, love and boastfulness, they're like that oil and water. They cannot abide. You can't be braggadocious and have agape love at the same time. And so the person who loves another person with agape will try to lift up the other person rather than boasting about his own great accomplishments. They're going to lift that other person up as better than themselves, is what Paul tells the Philippians. You look at somebody else and you say, I'm going to lift this person up higher than where I'm at. That's what agape love is. They don't brag. Then he says they're not arrogant. And this word arrogant means they're not puffed up or made proud. And this is the word where we get the word puffed up from. The person who loves another with agape love will try to build up that other person than trying to puff up his own reputation. And so very much related, braggadocious and someone who is arrogant, they're almost the same person. But if they're either one of those things, then they are not agape love. Verse 5, he says, does not act unbecomingly. And it seems odd that this word is a part of verse 5 rather than verse 4, because it really fits better with being boastful or arrogant with these words. But the idea is that you're going to not act in a way that is indecent or unseemingly or an ugly way. And the actions of the Corinthians at the Lord's Supper table, when they were partaking of it and using it as a way of distinguishing between themselves as someone that's better than somebody else, they were using that time in an unbecoming way, as a very ugly, indecent way. And so they had to correct themselves on that. If you're going to be loving, you can't be unbecoming. Then he says they do not seek their own. A person who loves another with agape love cannot at the same time be a selfish person, demanding of his own prerogatives. Agape love and selflessness are mutually exclusive. Then he says, is not provoked. Is not provoked. And the word has to do with being highly irritated or provoked to anger. Not being irritable or resentful is related to this word patience that we found in verse 4. When I read this one, it hit my heart more. Okay, I thought, gosh, Alex, you got to do better here. I'm somebody that easily gets irritated, and I'm sorry, Kira. I'm sorry. I need to do better with that. Not be provoked when something doesn't go the way that I expect it to go. I'm not going to be highly irritated or provoked to anger. I've got to be more patient. And then it says, does not take into an account a wrong suffered. I love this one. I actually called Kira on this one when I was studying this one, because the word here, does not take into account, has the connotation that is found in words that deal with accounting. So the idea is that somebody that loves or has an unconditional love does not keep a record or a ledger or a journal of all the transactions of good and evil. Okay, you hear all that accounting terms that are found right there? You're not going to keep a ledger of all the things that you've done wrong or that the other person has done wrong. You're not going to have a list. Whether that thing be one thing on the list or multiple things. Don't keep a record of anything that someone has done wrong to you about. Don't harbor up resentments and then unleash them later on. You don't get to do that. If you don't like something that somebody did, address it in the moment. Don't come back 5 weeks later and say, yeah, I didn't like it when you did this. That's wrong. That's keeping a record of all the things. That's not a good idea. Does not rejoice in unrighteousness. The person who loves sees unrighteousness and they grieve over it. They grieve over it. A person who loves with agape love will rejoice with those who are rejoicing and grieve with those who are grieving. And that's what he says next. They rejoice with the truth. And the word is this word, aletheia. And it usually means something that is true instead of false. However, in this context, it refers to behavior that is true to godly standards, upright behavior. The one who loves with agape love will not rejoice in another person's downfall, but will rejoice when the other person does what is right. That's rejoicing with the truth. Then he says that they bear all things. And this word, all things, is found each time after these: bears, believes, hopes, and endures. And the word here, bears, has two meanings in the New Testament. The first is to cover or to conceal, and the second one is to forbear or to endure. And the second meaning is what we find here in 1 Corinthians. Then it says believes all things. The word is pisteuo. Comes from the word pistis, which is faith. It means to believe in something or someone or to trust. They believe all things. It's the opposite of someone who is a skeptic, whose basic approach to life is to doubt or to disbelieve. Sometimes I find myself being a skeptic. I don't believe it. Well, somebody who has agape love can't be a skeptic anymore. They believe all things. The one who loves with agape love is optimistic and is believes the best about other people instead of worrying about what's the worst about other people. They hope all things. The person who loves with agape love doesn't give up easily on another person. They may recognize a problem, but hope to resolve that problem. They maintain this optimistic, positive attitude rather than a pessimistic, negative attitude. They hope all things. Nothing is excluded. And then endures all things. The word here, again, comes from two Greek words, hypo, under, and then meno, to remain. In other words, at the highest point, the hypo, you remain. You steadfastly move through. It suggests the idea of hunkering down to get through something in a more of a defensive posture. And that's what agape love is. All right, let's read the last few verses and then we'll finish this up. I know we've got just 5 minutes, but we're going to get through this. It's not too hard. The rest of it isn't. I wanted to spend more time in the way that this is described, and then we'll finish this up. And we'll see Paul's point, and the application is even easier. All right? So, verses 4 through 7. All right? Love never fails, but if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part, we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I also have been fully known. But now, faith, hope, love, abide these three. But the greatest of these is love. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. He first of all says that love never fails. The idea here is that it never falls off is the word here. It never falls off. It keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. It never fails. It never falls off. But then, it's not like the other gifts of prophecy, of tongues, or even of knowledge. Unlike love, prophecy, speaking in tongues, and knowledge, they're coming to an end for the Corinthians when the church would be fully matured. It isn't that these aren't good gifts, but they would only be useful for a time period, a limited time period. Those gifts would be done away with, only for a moment. So here he says they will be done away. The idea here is that it's going to be abolished, set aside, or wiped out. They will cease, even a stronger language here. In other words, they will stop. And then again, he uses the word done away with, again, when describing knowledge. So when Paul wrote this to the Corinthians, there are some things that are still unknown, that have not been revealed for the church. They don't have the New Testament to go by. And so for the church in Corinth to know God's will, they were dependent on those that could prophesy to explain God's will. But then there would be maturity. There would be maturity. He says, for we know in part and we prophesy in part. And that's a key word right there. Know in part, it's the word gnosko. You understand in part. In other words, it has the word like to share, or you've got to divide it out. It's been parted. And he says, we prophesy in part. But then in verse 10 he says, but when the perfect comes, when full maturity comes, that's the word right there. This word here, perfect, means mature. When the mature comes, that which is in part, partial, again, will be done away with, abolished, set aside, or wiped out. So there was some more things for them to have later on. They needed to mature. And those gifts, they aided them now in their spiritual growth and the understanding of God's will. But they're not always going to be needed. The gifts were to continue until maturity was accomplished. Paul writes about this in Philippians chapter 4, when he talks about attaining unity and the knowledge. And Paul explains the whole matter there, showing that the miraculous gifts were to serve the church till the knowledge was revealed to make them one in faith. The knowledge that is given in the New Testament. A lot of people ask, what is this perfect? What is this perfect? Well, I don't know exactly. But I do know this. That which is mature is that which is accomplished and completed. And for me, when I read this, and in this context, the New Testament is completed. The New Testament is mature. And when they have that, there's no need to find out what the oracles of God are, what the will of God is. They had the will of God when they had the completed New Testament. And so when that perfect, the mature comes, the other miraculous gifts would be done away with. But love never fails. It always will be. All right, so let me move forward just a little bit. I think I've got, did I do that right? Yeah, good. It updated then. I was wondering if it did or not. Okay, so then he says, when I was a child, I used to speak like a child. I'm not going to break down that one as much. Reason like a child, we can understand that. When I was a man, I did away. There it is again. That's the same word as with what he said earlier about the gifts. Abolish, I set aside the childish things. Then verse 12, he says, for now we see in a mirror dimly. The word there means that it's indirect, it's an image, or it's obscure. Right now we don't see everything is what he says. But then later on, it'll be face to face. No doubt about it then. He says, now I know in part, but then I will know, will fully recognize, will fully understand. Just as I've also have been fully, again here, fully known. And then he says, verse 13, but now faith, hope, love abide. Faith, this word faith, same word that we found earlier when he talked about if I have all the faith to move mountains. And then when he says love believes all things, it's the same word again, verse 13. But now faith, pistos, he says hope, and then love. This word hope is the idea of expectation. And then again, agape. Abide, these three. These things are there. But the greatest, the one that's the largest, the greater, the mega, that's the word there, of these is love. Agape love. Why is that the case? Because faith and hope are one day going to be done away with. When we can see Jesus face to face and we're in heaven, there's no reason for faith. Faith doesn't go on forever. Did you know that? When we're in heaven, you don't have to have... What is faith? Well, the Hebrew author defines faith as the substance of things hopeful, the substance of things not seen, right? The evidence of things not seen. But when you're seeing Jesus face to face, you don't need faith anymore. Hope is an expectation. And when you're seeing Jesus face to face, you're not expecting to see Jesus anymore. So even faith and hope, just like those other gifts that he's mentioned earlier, speaking in tongues, prophecy, knowledge, all those things, even down to faith and hope, will be done away with one day. And the greatest is love, because love never fails. Love remains, and it will remain throughout all of eternity. That's what's going to keep us there. And that's why it's the greatest. So the more excellent way that he told them, the very end of chapter 12, is love. More so than any gift that they may have in the Corinthian church. Amazing, isn't it? All right, so now let me give you quickly the application, and then we'll be dismissed here in just a moment, okay? Would you get me an application sheet so I can just follow along with you guys? Dylan, everybody give Dylan a round of applause for helping me out. Good job, Dylan. Thank you, sir. All right, so the question is, why is blank so important? Why is love so important? Well, we can see that right here. What we've learned, what we need to take into account when we've gone through 1 Corinthians 13, love... Sorry. Thank you. Why is love so important? Love goes in that blank. Well, here's the reasons. Love needs to be a way of life. Love needs to be a way of life. It's not just something that you say, well, I love you. Sometimes the word love is overly used, because I love tacos. But thankfully, I think, Kira, I love you more than I love tacos. All right? Well, love needs to be a way of life because tacos is not a way of life. But Kira, for me, is my way of life. I love Kira, but I love the Lord more than I love Kira. And the love that I have for the Lord needs to be my way of life and your way of life. It's the more excellent way. All right, the next one is love is countercultural. Love is countercultural. Yeah, counterculture. Our world uses love, like I said, in all kinds of different ways. And the idea of unconditional love goes against the way that the world views love. The way that God loves us is unconditional. But sometimes even in this world, our world just doesn't really understand it. They don't understand it. Our world doesn't understand why you're here tonight. They don't. You can do all kinds of other great things, but you love the Lord. Unconditionally. It doesn't matter. Anything else that could go on in your life, you see this as the most important. Because you love the Lord. It's countercultural. All right, the last thing that kind of helps us is application is love is Christ-like. There's no greater love than the love that Christ has for us. And the fact that He would give Himself upon the cross. Oh man, and that's the kind of love that we need to have. Love like Jesus loves. Giving up your complete self. Amazing.